In today's exploration, we travel to the southeast coast of Scotland and the Firth of Forth in search of an abandoned mansion and instead discover a mysterious tower and the story of a forgotten Scottish hero. Scotland has since the earliest of times been closely connected to the sea, with its countless islands, long coastlines, and far-flung settlements. Today this coast is home to golf courses, beautiful beaches where you can get an ice cream, or even a scenic castle. However, it has not always been so, and in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it was here on the shores of the Firth of Forth that much of the fortunes of the Kingdom of Scotland would be won or lost in conflict. Abandoned lost tower of a forgotten Scottish hero. As we headed into the countryside in search of a mansion that was built in the 1700s, we became turned around in the woods and the thick vegetation growing in the area. Unable to locate the mansion, presumably buried in the trees, I sighted a lone spired tower sticking into the air. After tearing my pants on a barbed wire fence, we began to push through the deep plant growth which covered old walls and foundations and seemed to obscure a number of buildings. Knowing the dangers of old wells, especially when you can't see your feet, we moved slowly ahead.
This was probably a really cool garden at one point. There's a lot of bees, so be careful.
Up a short flight of steps, the door lays open.
Oh my goodness, there's eggs on the ground. This is a real dovecote.
Above are racks of shelving, which along with the eggs below, point at this being an out-of-use dovecote. More often these are seen across Scotland in a beehive shape and were used from the 1400s to the 1700s to provide nests for doves and pigeons that were harvested as a food source, providing eggs, meat, and fertilizer. The rise of year-round winter animal feed caused their eventual fall from use. We head out around the other side and find a doorway and exposed stone walls running some distance on both sides.
This is a real Rapunzel's tower.
From here it's easy to see that there are 4 stories, and it must rise about 40 feet in total. The vaulting inside seems older, and in the back is a bricked-off doorway.
Smells bad in here.
The tower was a true mystery, and it would not be until much later that I would finally discover its true story stretching back into time and just how important its builder was to the history of modern Scotland. While the mansion we were searching for was built in the 1700s, it in fact, unknown to me, had been placed near a much older mansion of which few records exist. This earlier house was demolished in 1741 and belonged to a man named Andrew Wood, a humble captain who would rise to great fame, in time becoming known as the Admiral Nelson of Scotland. Andrew was born around 1455 in Fife and was part of the Wood clan, which had been known for generations of service to the crown. In fact, they also briefly owned the mansion in our last video. His early years were spent as a merchant, and he came to own a ship named the Flower, in which he would often fight off pirate attacks. As his success as a merchant grew, he also obtained the Yellow Caravel, which would trade in the Netherlands. His 2 ships were heavily armed, and in time he would use them to in turn attack English ships as a privateer. In the 1480s, he attracted the attention of King James III, who made him a royal captain, and later, around 1483, as a reward, he was granted the lands the tower stands upon. Soon afterwards, in 1488, he would come to the rescue of the king, taking James III and his 30,000 backers across the Forth to fight rebels who had gathered to the south. Unfortunately, James was to march to Blackness Castle and then disband his army while negotiating with them. The rebels instead took up arms again and fought him at the Battle of Sauchiburn. Here James was injured after being thrown from his horse during the fighting, in which his forces were defeated. He sought refuge in a mill while trying to meet with Sir Wood, who was off the coast with his 2 ships waiting for the king if the battle was to turn against him. However, before he could do so, he was stabbed to death by a man posing as a priest while inside the mill. Learning of the defeat, Wood began to rescue wounded men from the fighting and was soon contacted by the rebels who were looking for James III. Stories say that Wood was summoned by the council of rebels, and when he appeared before the 16-year-old Prince James, he began to cry and asked, "Sir, are you my father?" Wood replied, "I am not your father, but his faithful servant, and the enemy of those who have occasioned his downfall." Some of the lords then asked, "Know you where the king is, or who those were that you took on board after the battle?" "As for the king," replied Sir Andrew, "I know nothing of him. My brothers and I were ready to have risked our lives in his defense." And Wood stated that if the king were alive, he was resolved to obey none but him, and if he were slain, he was ready to avenge him. Wood left, and afterwards the rebels commanded 11 captains to send ships to defeat him, but the captains all declined, saying his 2 ships were all too well equipped and Wood too skillful to defeat. In time, James III's death was discovered, but Wood would not swear allegiance to the newly crowned James IV. Eventually, Wood showed up at Aberdeen, demanding rights to lands that were given to him by James III. At this time, in 1488, King Henry VII of England sent 5 large privateer ships to attack merchants in towns in the Firth of Forth. James IV, having been unable to get local ship captains to agree to confront them, summoned Sir Wood before his court. Here Wood agreed to fight them in the name of defending the country. Wood brought his 2 ships into battle and was able to capture the 5 English privateer ships off of Dunbar in a stunning victory. Hailed as a hero for this victory in 1491, Wood was given rights to build a fortified tower house surrounded by a moat on the site the Lone Tower now stands upon. According to records, this new tower was built by the English sailors Wood had captured upon an old estate that was once a royal retreat for past widowed queens of Scotland. Shortly after, in 1495, he was knighted. Soon after the battle, the enraged King Henry VII of England put out a £1,000 bounty for any captain that would capture Wood. Sir Stephen Bull accepted the challenge and sailed into the Firth of Forth with 3 heavily armed ships. He captured some local fishermen to use to identify Wood's boats with, and then he laid in wait for his return from Flanders. Soon Wood's 2 ships were spotted and pursued. Wood proclaimed to his men, "These, my lads, are the foes who expect to convey us in bonds to the English king. But for your courage and the help of God, they shall fall. Set yourselves in order, every man to his station. Charge, gunners, let the crossbows be ready. Have the lime pots and fireballs to the tops, and the 2-handed swords to the forerooms. Be stout, be diligent, for your own sakes and for the honor of this realm." The men were given wine and cheered. A long and close battle began, lasting all night with crowds of watchers on the shores. The next day, the ships pulled apart in time, and the next dawn the fighting began again. Eventually, the English ships grounded on sandbars and were captured and brought to James IV, who let them free, saying he desired them to inform their master that Scotland, like England, could boast of brave and warlike sons both by sea and land, and that England should not more disturb the Scottish seas, else a different fate would hereafter await the intruders. After this new victory, Wood was made Admiral of Scotland and leader of its newly growing navy. He was then tasked in 1493 by James IV to bring the Lords of the Isles lands under the throne's control following the death of Chief MacDonald II. In 1503, Wood set out with his ships against rebel chiefs of the Isles and captured one of their fortresses on the Isle of Mull. Interestingly, it was around this time that while serving King James IV of Scotland, that Wood was known to have built a canal from his tower house to the local church. He would sail a barge with the help of captured English prisoners of war every Sunday to services as he hated traveling on land. Some traces of this canal still exist running over 700 feet from the mansion site. During these years, in 1505, James IV began construction of what would be the largest and most formidable ship of its time, the Great Michael, named after the Archangel. The ship was a massive 240-foot long, 36-foot wide, 1,400 crewman battleship that weighed 1,000 tons and had 10-foot thick sides and 57 cannons. It was produced at the port of Leith, which Sir Wood had expanded to be a major shipbuilding town. The ship was finished in 1512, dwarfing any other ship at sea, until the same year a jealous Henry VII built a slightly larger ship called the Grace Adieu. Originally, the Great Michael was meant to be the spearhead of a Scottish campaign to recapture the Holy Land, but in 1513, it sailed with a 3-ship Scottish fleet supporting the French. Wood was removed as its captain for the campaign, and the Earl of Arran commanded the fleet, which he instead used to attack Carrickfergus, Ireland. James was enraged and sent Sir Wood to take over command. However, by then the Earl had already headed to France. Shortly afterwards, with the disastrous defeat of the Scottish at the Battle of Flodden, the ship was sold to the French, and Wood became ambassador to France. During the battle, James IV was slain, as well as Wood's cousin Walter and his son. It was then that Sir Wood would become regent for the child King James V, reaching his highest office. Sir Wood is listed as dying 2 years later in 1515. However, some records say that in 1526 he was sent by the young King James V to protect the Earl of Lennox, who at the request of the king's mother was trying to take the king from the protection of the pro-English Douglas clan who had been forcibly holding him as a pawn. Wood arrived just in time to see Sir James Hamilton murder the Earl following his capture in the resulting Battle of Linlithgow Bridge. This alternate record instead also states that afterwards, Wood lived to a great age, dying in 1540, and that his remains were sailed down the canal by torchlight to the church for burial there. Whatever the case, in time the family motto would adapt to his achievements, becoming Tudus in Undis, safe amid the waves, and their crest would bear his ship, the Yellow Caravel. In his lifetime, Wood today is remembered by many as the Admiral Nelson of Scotland, and for having saved Scotland from naval blockade by the English, as well as his amazing victories at sea and his establishment of a national shipbuilding industry. Andrew's house, on his death, passed to the eldest of his 4 sons through his wife, Elizabeth London. This younger Andrew gained great favor with James V and was on his council. When he died, he was followed by another Andrew Wood, who was a member of the Parliament in 1560, signing an order for the protection of a baby James VI. He died in 1592, and his daughter had a son, Andrew Wood, who had a son, James. His son, John, was the last of the line and founded a hospital and fund for poor Clan Wood members, as well as a local school. He died in 1661 and was buried near the Great Admiral. By 1611, the lands had already passed to Peter Black, who some believe either renovated or built the tower we explored today as part of a major rebuilding of Andrew Wood's fortified house into a mansion. I imagine it to have looked something like this. In the following years, the land would pass from the Black family as well, until one day in 1741, the house was demolished to make way for the owner's new mansion, leaving just the tower standing, having likely been at one side of the larger fortified house. To each side of it, for 60 feet, still stretches the original walls that would have been the fortified courtyard known as a barmkin. The tower, with its 3-foot-thick walls standing 16 feet across and some 40 feet tall, was then slowly to lose its identity and meaning. Luckily, I found its story was captured in drawings and some early photographs, the first of which shows it appearing to have been left with a remaining stairway to the north side, along with a chimney and the foundations of the house. In time, the area around it was turned into a stately garden, and it became an ornament, still attached to the tall earlier wall. Sometime in these years, it was made into a dovecote. Finally, the garden fell into disuse with the abandonment of the mansion, and the tower fell into decay again. In 1978, a local society stepped in and fully restored it, but since then, it again has fallen into decay, becoming a lone fairy tale spire in the midst of a vast and overgrown Victorian garden. But I've noticed more than the tower here. There's the mystery of the nearby ruinous buildings, one of which appears to be a cottage in this photo. It's fully overgrown, but there's a house next to it as well. We fight our way through the deep plants and grass in what would have been the probable site of Sir Wood's tower house. Only to find a drop into an old basement and unknown footing. Going out and around it, there's a long stone-walled structure that seems like the old cottage. Ivy-covered windows and doors lead to a collapsing interior. While the walls are intact, the roof is mostly gone, as are the floors. There's a sink full of plants.
Why can still, there's like still some molding on the walls. Quite a smell. Not a good one.
Above, the structure seems very different from the inside, as if a newer building of brick and plaster was built inside an older stone and mortar shell.
Ceiling tiles in here. Oh, pillbox.
Old red clay tiles cover parts of the floor.
some more in here. Toilet? Yep. Okay.
It's very clear that the outer walls are much older. Some areas show brick, but most is of an older stonework.
This must be the chimney. Maybe there's a second one. Yeah, because those look like places. Well,
It strikes me that it's possible that one of the house's walls may in fact be the opposite wall of the original Sir Andrew Wood era one along the tower's side. It's often the case that when an old house is demolished, the stone is reused, and in this way, the house we stand in and the entire wall in front of us may be the very mansion that has vanished from sight and record.
super safe.
It's hard to say for sure what's left today under the deep undergrowth, but as we leave this place, one thing is clear. This site holds many secrets that are yet to be discovered, and it remains today one of the least known historic locations tied to the national story of Scotland and a forgotten hero of its people. Join us next time as we explore an abandoned mansion of tragedy. Thank you for watching. For more unique abandoned places and their lost stories, follow us today by subscribing and hitting the bell icon.